Welcome to the Shir in Techias Chelek Yud Gimel Chukas Beis. In this fascinating Sikha, the Rabbi is going to teach us a rule, not about what the Torah says, but about what the Torah doesn't say. A fascinating klal. This Sikha is a classic in the work Oitzer Lekutei Sichas, where one Sikha per parsha is selected as a Pshutei Shamikra Sikha. This Sikha is selected for Parshas Chukas. The story that the Sikha is based on is very short and somewhat mysterious. The story takes place the 40th year after the Yidden left Mitzrayim. All those who left Mitzrayim have already passed away. Aaron, the Kohen Gadol, passes away. The Anane HaKaved leave from the Jewish people. Amalek hears this and attacks them. And after Aaron's passing and the attack from Amalek, the Jewish people grow wary and they begin retreating back towards Mitzrayim. They retreat a full 7 journeys back towards Mitzrayim. This is where the Torah begins, and we're going to read it inside. If you have the handout, it's the first text. Pasuk, it's Perek Chaf Aleph Pasuk Dalet. Vayisu me'ahar hahar, the Jewish people travel backwards from Har Hahar, where Aaron passes away. Derech Yamsuf, they go back towards the Yamsuf. Lisvay, because of their despondency, they're retreating. Lisvay ves Eretz Edom, and they are going to have to circle Edom because Edom did not let them pass through earlier, directly towards Eretz Yisrael. But Tiktzah nefesh ha'am b'derech, and the spirit of the people grew short with the way. And the people come and they speak against Abish and they speak against Moshe and they say, listen, why did he take us out of Mitzrayim? We should die in the desert. There's no bread over here. There's nothing to eat. We have to rely on the man. And there's no normal source of water. We have to rely on the Be'er Shamiriam. And our soul is at its limit. We are up to our end with this insubstantial food. That's what they refer to them on. Upon hearing their complaints, by Yishalach Hashem Ba'am, Hashem sends among the people Es Hanechashim, the snakes, Hasirafim, the burning ones, by Yinashchu Esam, and they bit the people, by Yamas Am Rav Yisrael, and a large multitude of Bnei Yisrael died. Rashi here tells us 2 Rashis. First, why, and you have it in the handouts, it says, As hanechashim hasirafim, the snakes, the burning ones. Says Rashi, why are they called the burning ones? Shesurfim esa adam, because they burn a person, be'eres shneim, with their venom, they burn a person. Vayinashchu esa and the snakes bit the people. Why snakes? Says Rashi, 2 reasons. Number 1, the snake, which was punished for speaking against Hashem, was sent to exact punishment for those who maliciously also spoke against Abisha, against Moshe. And number 2 is the snake it has a punishment that whatever it tastes like dust. So let it exact punishment from those who spoke against the man, that it's one food that has many different tastes. The ungratefulness, and the snake exacts punishment for this level of ungratefulness. Okay, so Hashem sends snakes. Pasuk Zayir. El Moshe, so the people come to Moshe and they say, Chatanu, we have sinned. Kidibarnu b'Hashem ubach. We spoke against the Eibishter, we spoke against you. Hispalel Hashem, please, daven to the Eibishter, v'yasser me'aleinu es hanachash, and remove the snake from us. Right away, Moshe acquiesces, v'yispalel Moshe b'adam, and Moshe davens on behalf of the people. Hashem says to Moshe, well, here's what we're going to do. Asei lecha saraf, make for yourself a burning one. V'sim oisai al nes, and place it on a pole. And it will be kol hanoshuch, anybody that is bitten, he will see this snake, and he will live. Okay, make a snake, put it on a pole, and the people will see it and live. Pasuk test. This is going to be the central pasuk of our Sikha. Vayas Moshe nechash nechoshes. And Moshe made a copper serpent, snake of copper. Vayisimeu al meis, and he placed it on a pole. Vahoya, and it was ino shach hanochash es ish. If the snake bit somebody, the he bit that person would stare el nechash hanachoshes to the copper snake, vachoy, and he would live. So here we have two Rashis on this pasuk. The first is on the latter part of the pasuk. And it is im noshach hanochash es ish. If the snake bit a person, so says Rashi, quotes from the Mishnah. V'amar Rabbeinu, our sages say, "V'chi nochash meimis oy mechaya." Does this snake cause death or give life? Rather, Ella bisman Yisrael mistaklim klape maila. Remember, the snake was put on a pole. So when you would look at the snake, you had to look upwards towards heaven. When the Yidden looked up towards heaven, umishab demesliba laviyam shabbat shamayim, and they would subjugate their heart to their Father in heaven. Hayu mirabim, then they would be cured. V'im lav. But if they didn't do that, they didn't look towards heaven and they didn't subjugate themselves, hayu nimaikim, they would waste away. And now we have a Rashi on the earlier part of the pasuk. Nechash nechoshes. Moshe makes a copper snake. Says Rashi, loy nemar loy la'asoi seishal nechoshes. Hashem did not instruct Moshe to make it out of copper. If you look in the pasuk earlier, Hashem just said, make a snake, aseh lecha saraf, make a burning one and put it on a pole. He doesn't tell him what to make it out of. So Hashem didn't tell him to make it out of copper. Ela Amar Moshe. So why does he make it out of copper? Because Moshe said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu koirei nachash. Hashem refers to this as a nachash. Va'ani esenu shel nachoshes. So I will make it out of copper. Why? Lashon neifel al lashon, an expression falling on an expression. In other words, the word nachash is related to the word nechoshes. Hashem says, make this nachash, the same letters as the word nechoshes, so I'll make it out of nechoshes, because the words are related to each other. This is the key Rashi that our Sikha is going to analyze. So just a little comment is that if you look in your Chumashim, the orders of the Rashi might be a little different than the way I cited them. And in the Ha'aris of the Sikha, the Rebbe deals with how the Rashis are placed. But the way I quoted them is the way that the Rebbe teaches them in the Sikha and explains in the Ha'aris. So here the Rebbe has 4 questions. On this Rashi, Loi nemar loi la'asei shel nechoshes. Rashi begins and he says, Hashem did not instruct Moshe to make it out of copper, which is seemingly a question. In other words, the Torah says he made a copper snake, but Hashem didn't tell him to make it out of copper. Seemingly a question. Why this intro? Usually Rashi gets to the point. Could have just said, Hashem called it a nachash, and therefore Moshe kind of learned that it's related to nechoshes. So why the intro? Hashem didn't tell him to make it out of nechoshes. Number 2 is that that's actually obvious. If you look in the earlier pasuk, Hashem said, make a nachash and put it on the pole. No mention of making a copper nachash. So not only Rashi doesn't usually ask questions, in this case, the question is quite obvious. Number 3, and this question the Ramban asked as well. It says over here, HaKadosh Baruch Hu called it a nachash. Whoa. Look back at the earlier pasuk Ches. Hashem said to Moshe, Asay lecha saraf. Make a saraf. Hashem doesn't call it a nachash. It says that the nechashim hasarafim came and bit the people. But Hashem told Moshe, he said, make a saraf. And number 4, the order of the Rashis. Like I shared with you in pasuk Tes, in our pasuk, Rashi explains the latter part of the pasuk. The fact that people would look up. If they were bitten by the snake, they looked up at the snake and they would live, prior to explaining the earlier part of the pasuk that Moshe makes a nachash out of copper. 4 questions in this Rashi. Let's begin with the obvious and basic question number 3. Rashi tells us that Moshe said to himself, HaKadosh Baruch Hu koid a nachash, Hashem calls this a nachash, therefore I will make it out of nechoshes. And like we said, that in the pasuk, HaKadosh Baruch Hu calls it a saraf. He doesn't call it a nachash. So here is a principle in the Torah. And this is such an obvious principle that Rashi doesn't even tell it to us. He doesn't tell it to us here. He doesn't tell it to us in other places. It's a principle that the Rebbe doesn't innovate. It's accepted by all the Parshani HaMikra. It's a very obvious principle. But the Rebbe cites it in this context, and others do as well, which is that the Torah does not tell us every detail of the conversations between the Eibishter and Moshe. As a matter of fact, sometimes the Torah will tell us a part of the conversation between the Eibishter and Moshe. And when Moshe will give the Yidden the mitzvah, Moshe will tell us more than we heard in the original instruction. And we know, of course, that whatever Moshe says comes from the divine. So that doesn't bother us. Sometimes we won't hear the conversation between Hashem and Moshe won't be recorded at all. There'll just be an instruction from Moshe to Bnei Yisrael. And again, we know whatever Moshe tells us, Moshe is receiving from the divine. So the rule is that Moshe tells us, and the Torah records matters that are not necessarily recorded in the conversation between Hashem and Moshe. And we know that they're there. Sometimes the Torah abbreviates and condenses those conversations. Well, here, the pasuk says, Hashem comes to Moshe and he says in pasuk Tes, pasuk Ches, Asay lecha sadaf. Make for yourself a sadaf, a burning one. Now we know from the beginning of the story, the nechashim hasirafim, the snakes, the burning ones, that the burning is an adjective. It's a way to explain or to describe the snakes. They're not their own type of snake. Rashi says the snakes, the burning ones. They're called the burning ones because they have venomous, because they are venomous and they burn with their bite. So the word asay lecha sadaf, make for yourself a sadaf, means make for yourself the burning one. The burning what? Well, obviously Hashem didn't say make the burning one. Hashem said to Moshe, make a nachash sadaf. Make a snake a burning one. The Torah omits the word nachash. And it tells us the main word, the burning one. Because the problem is that the people were being burnt. And we're going to rectify this by Moshe making a replica of the burning one. But that is just an adjective of the nachash, of the snake. And it is obvious to us that Hashem says to Moshe, make a nachash saraf, make a burning snake. The Torah just realized that we know this from the context, from the previous pasuk, that the whole problem came about because the nechashim hasrafim, the burning snakes. So this is the first principle that the Rebbe cites. The others, by the way, Torah Tamima, for example, on this pasuk, also cites this principle that the Torah can omit a few words or a lot of words or the communication with Moshe altogether, and we know from Moshe's communication to us that this is what the Eibishter said. But here we understand that we're talking about Hashem said make a nachash saraf, because that would be a proper way of communication, and the Torah simply omits the word nachash. Like I said, this is an accepted principle. But the Rebbe is going to take this principle now a step further. Because if indeed there is gaps in the communication, in the record of communication between the Eibishter and Moshe, which are fully accepted, so when Moshe makes a nechash nechoshes, he makes a copper serpent. Maybe the Eibishter told him to make it out of nechoshes. Maybe Hashem told him to make it out of copper. So here, the Rebbe teaches us a deeper understanding of this principle of the gaps in the Torah, in a sense, in the communication that's not shared with us. And the Rebbe says, read the Rashi like this. Loi nemar loi la soise shel nechoshes. It's not a question. Rashi is our teacher, and he's teaching us something. He's teaching us that Hashem didn't instruct him to make it out of copper. That wasn't part of the instruction. How does Rashi know? Moshe made it out of copper. Everything Moshe does, the Eibishter told us to do. Told him to do, told us. So why wouldn't we assume that the Eibishter told him to make it out of copper? So Rashi tells us, he prefaces this Rashi that Hashem didn't instruct him to make it out of copper. He prefaces it with explaining the latter part of the pasuk that says, "V'ho yokol hanoshuch," anybody that is bitten will look at the snake and will live. And Rashi says, quotes the Maimar Chazal, "V'chinochash meimis," does the snake bring death? Or does the snake give life? No. When the Yidden look up and they to look towards heaven and they subjugate their heart, that's what brings life or death. In other words, there's no power in the snake itself. There's no meaning, or there's no greatness in this particular instrument. It was just a way to get the people to look up. Why did it have to be a snake? It had to be a snake because through a snake, while they looked up at the snake, they saw the source of the problem. And they were reminded, like Rashi told us, the messages of the snake. Shalaka aleitzos diba, because the snake spoke slanderously. And they reminded of their ingratefulness. The snake only tastes dust. So Moshe made a representation of the snake. But the snake had no inherent powers to itself. It was just a way to get them to look upwards. So if it's just a way to get them to look upwards, who cares what it's made out of? Wood, copper, plastic. What's the difference? So Rashi tells us, Loi nemar loi la'asoisa shel nechoshes. Since inherently we understand that there's no reason to care about what it's made out of. It's just literally a pointer towards heaven and a reminder of their sin. So there's no reason for us to add and to say, well, Hashem told him to make it out of nechoshes. There's no reason to infer that. In other words, this could have been left up to Moshe. And we learned that, you know what, Hashem told Moshe, make a snake, make it out of whatever you want. So here we have a beautiful explanation in this klal, in this rule in the Torah. In other words, there are gaps that are not recorded in the instructions from the Eibishter to Moshe. And we trust that everything Moshe does is from the divine. However, that rule applies if it makes a difference. If it doesn't make a difference, in other words, if the materials of this, if the snake is immaterial in the sense we don't care what the snake is made out of, it's just a representation to remind them of their sin and get them to look upwards. So we don't need to infer that Hashem told Moshe what materials to make it out of. Says Rashi, you know what? Hashem didn't tell him to make it out of copper. This was up to Moshe. Make it out of material. You'll figure out which material. Okay. Now we understand this rule of the gaps in the Torah. This is the Rebbe teaching us this rule that, like I said, all the Mefarshim understand it's a basic rule in the Torah. You can't learn the Torah otherwise because the gaps are obvious. But here we understand, but those we only fill in the gaps with required information. So now Rashi says, so why take copper? Or why does the Torah tell us that it was copper? He made a snake? Maybe he made it out of styrofoam. Says Rashi, because Moshe learned that HaKadosh Baruch Hu koirei nachash, since the Eibishter called it a nachash, I will make it out of copper, because the word nachoshes is related to the word nachash. And loshain noifel al loshain, and there is a concept of the words being related to each other simply because they're made out of the same letters. So therefore they are related to each other. And here we're learning a new concept, which is brought many, many times in Chassidus. The Rebbe quotes it quite often, which is this concept of the words themselves have a connection, the letters have a connection between themselves. Halacha l'maisa. In other words, we see that Moshe actually applies this. He applies this rule of learning out related words, nachash, nechoshes, therefore he makes it out of copper. So Moshe finds a connection. He sees a connection there. And we actually learn a rule, which is that we can learn from the name of a person, from the way a thing is called, from the letters of a person's name, we can learn a meaning and an insight into who they are and into what their personality is. This is the nigla part of the Sikha. Now, the Rebbe is going to take this to an entirely higher level, and that's going to be with the Hasidus aspect of the Sikha. So in Nigla, we've said that there are gaps, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu called it a nachash. But those gaps, if they're not necessary, then we don't need to infer that they're there, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't say nechoshes. Now the Rebbe is going to say, and according to Chassidus, this works out masterfully. The Torah doesn't say it's a nachash. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu did call it a nachash. And Moshe chooses to make it out of nechoshes. It all works out beautifully. And this is by understanding the depth and the profound meaning of this, the symbolism in this nachash. What does the nachash represent? The nachash represents Misa itself. It represents death itself. It represents Gimel Klippus HaTameis itself. And here, in this story, the Nachash that represents evil is actually the source of life itself. You see, when somebody was bitten by these venomous snakes, they were going to die. They were dead, good as dead. The only way that they wouldn't die is if they would look up at the snake, then v'choy, then the snake would bring them life. It's the only way they wouldn't die. So the snake, which is the source of, usually the source of Misa, actually in this case is related and becomes the source of Techias Hameisim, of the resurrection of the dead. So here we have a snake giving life. Where does Techias Hameisim come from? Where does the new life come from? Life, the source of life, gives life. But when life ends, it cannot return. When a person dies, the source of life cannot give life anymore. That's departed. That's done. Techias Hameisim has to come from the atmos, from the essence of the divine, which is beyond life and death. And when life comes from beyond life and death, then even the dead could be living. And when life comes from beyond life and death, even the snake, the source of death, can become a source of life. So what's happening here is that the people are looking up towards a snake and they are receiving life because the snake is being transcended by the essence, by the atzmos of Eretz, which shines through it to where this snake is not a symbol of evil anymore because there is no difference or differentiation. There's no good, there's no evil, there's no life, there's no death. There's the essence of the divine itself flowing through them. How does this happen? How does the Yid get life from the source of life through the snake, through looking upwards and subjugating his heart, subjugating the snake in his heart? Lavim Shabashamayim. The Yid looks upwards and he sees the snake, and then he looks towards heaven beyond the snake. And he then takes his inner snake and he subjugates it to the service of the Eibishter. Then the Yid, his own snake is transcended and his own snake is now engaged in the service of the divine. Similarly, his own snake will be, the snake itself now becomes a source of life instead of being a source of death. And Moshe makes it a nechash nechoishes, because just as the snake is a symbol of death, so too nechoishes, copper, is actually a symbol of that which is related to the klipa. Hence, the relationship between the words nachash and nechoishes, because as we said, the words themselves have a relationship, and the name of every matter expresses its source. So nechoishes also represents a level which is enclosed in the klipa. Copper is connected to evil. So when the snake is transformed, when the nachash is transformed, so the nechoishes also is transformed. Finally, we have this understanding of why it is that the HaKadosh Baruch Hu actually told Moshe that it's a nachash. Moshe said, but the Torah doesn't record that it's a nachash. The Torah just calls it a sadaf. If the Eibishter calls it a nachash, why does the Torah not write the word nachash, just write sadaf? So we said, according to Nigla, that's not a problem. But in Chassidus, we have a deeper meaning. This idea of transforming the nachash, that the nachash can become fully transformed and can become a source of life, is an idea that exists beyond the Torah. In the Torah itself, within the limitations of the Torah, so the snake in the Torah is a source of evil. It's a source of death. It's not a source of life. HaKadosh Baruch Hu kairei nachash, but the Eibishter, the source of Torah, which is higher than Torah, the Eibishter says, make a nachash into the source of life. But in Torah, it does calls it a sadaf. The Torah doesn't record it on the level of Torah, in the organization of Torah. Nachash is the source of evil. HaKadosh Baruch Hu kairei nachash, but the Eibishter, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, there is a nachash, the source of all things, can say and can transcend and does transcend the nachash and makes it a source of life instead of a source of evil. So in summary, we have in the Nigla part of the Sikha, we have explained that Hashem actually refers to this as a nachash sadaf, and the Torah is allowed to leave out a gap, but those gaps only are we only fill in those gaps when they must be filled in. In other words, like in the case of nechoshes, there's no reason, since it's immaterial what the material was, there's no reason to say that Hashem told Moshe to make it out of nechoshes. And Moshe made it out of nechoshes, and the Torah records that to teach us that words are related to each other. And in the Chassidus part of the Sikha, we've brought it all together, and we've said that it's not just because of rules and technicalities. This story is a story of Techias Hameisim. Techias Hameisim is related to the essence of the divine. And on that level, even the nachash can become the source of life. And therefore, it's made out of nechoshes, which is similarly clean. But that level exists within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, beyond the source of Torah. Thank you for joining me.